So some of the things that we've looked at so far have looked at the chromosomes and alleles and how they are carried on into other generations, how the frequency of certain alleles in the populations will be different, how they could either stay the same or change over time, and how when they change over time, that's what will lead to evolution and then potentially to speciation. Okay, so, but that's a little, those are two slightly different things. I mean, so evolution is a process which just is change over time, and it may not lead directly to speciation, and it may take a very long time, or it actually may not, depending on a whole variety of different factors. And so what we're going to look at here is how does actual speciation occur? Okay, what does it mean to then be, a species? For speciation to occur, some of those things already have to happen. So we have to have, changes in different alleles in a population, and then populations actually start to become different from one another. So, so how does it happen? There's sort of the genetic part. Okay, so how does speciation occur? We have the changes in alleles, and then also even larger, genetic changes. So frequencies of alleles, some that are more common than others, and then even through mutation, new genes and different variations of genes coming into the population. So there's that aspect of it. Then we have, sort of separating groups that are different from one another, or essentially instead of having a population with a lot of diversity just within it, having some of that population be separated from the other to become a distinct population, which then might become a distinct species. All right. So some of that I mentioned in one of the last lectures is going to occur through isolation. All right, so I talked about, say, like a founder's effect. So when some organisms in one population are transported to an island and there's no members of that species there, that then they take a small group of genes, a different frequency most likely of alleles, to that population, and then over time they become very distinct from the original, potentially then becoming new species, which again, we'll get to the definition of that in a little bit. So we have different types of isolation and isolation events. And the process of speciation is then usually broken down in two ways. So we can either have speciation, being what's referred to as allopatric, or sympatric. And then there's also a parapatric, which is sort of in between kind of the two. But allopatric speciation is when there's an actual divide or a barrier. So, and really in this case, it's more of a geographic barrier. So you essentially have a population of organisms, and then at some point in time, something physically divides them into two populations. This group and this group over here. Forces act on them differently. Maybe, if the original group is still has all the same resources and everything else, and the same frequency of alleles that they had in the original population, they stay pretty much the same. Or they might get one group of alleles with a different frequency. The others might have a different frequency from them and the original population. So they might both change, or one of them may change. It all depends on somewhat chance, sort of in terms of the alleles that go into each group. But again, if it was like an island habitat and there were different food availability or slightly different climate, then what you might see happen, over time, is that one of these groups pretty much stays the same as the original population, but the second group diverges and then becomes completely unique, right? And it's not the same as the original, and it becomes then a new species. Again, what will make it a species different from this one isn't just its appearance; it has to do with reproduction, which we'll get to, which is the definition of biological species, which I've mentioned earlier on in the earlier lectures, but we'll come back to it come back around to it again and repeat some of that. So we have some geographic barrier that provides isolation. Now we can also have sympatric speciation, which is where we have one population, and then within that population, some subgroup starts to become different than the other. And then they eventually, over time, diverge, into two distinct groups. But they were not geographically separated. The changes all occurred while they were geographically overlapping with one another. So then you might ask, well, how is that going to happen? Okay, what would happen there? And that's where we'll talk about some of these barriers. All right, for when will speciation occur? What sorts of things would lead to this process to actually happen? So, one example could be temporal isolation. So isolation in time. So an example, this might be organisms. So we'll do temporal here. One group of organisms starts to reproduce at a different season. So spring reproduction versus fall reproduction. They're not all reproductive all at the same time. And so one group doesn't mate with the other group because they're not reproductive. And if those individuals involved in those different reproductions then have different frequencies of alleles, then they'll start to give rise to individuals with more and more differences between them until they might become new species. Another temporal type isolation might be nocturnal or diurnal. So, day versus night active, which could have to do with avoiding predators or foraging or those sorts of activities. And so they don't actually encounter one another because they're not active at the same time, so they can't mate with one another. So technically maybe they could mate and have offspring successfully, they're just not awake at the same time. So they're isolated essentially from one another, even though they overlap. They can be in the same place, but they're just not active at the same time. So that's temporal isolation. Ecological isolation is kind of where we get sort of a little niche, habitats, occurring within this area. And that's what we kind of actually has the parapatric is really sort of like where there's a niche habitat, actually within this zone that the organisms live in, and they have some subgroup that becomes a little more prefers that habitat a little bit more, becomes a little bit more well adapted to that particular habitat than the broader habitat, and they start to become a little more and more specialized. So it's kind of about specialization within some larger habitat. And then those individuals then start to become different than the others in the broader habitat, and then they diverge and become a new species. That's an idea. Behavioral isolation. Here's where individuals do a whole variety of things to initiate mating. So different types of calls. Many animals have calls, birds and amphibians and others have some kind of call for mates, and many insects do as well that attract them. Fireflies, if you might see them flashing, at night, you might notice there's different colors of firefly. There's actually a little more, some that have more of a yellow color, some that have more of a greenish color to them. Some of them flash actually at different times of night, so there's a temporal isolation. The color, the flashing pattern is different, so there's a behavior to the signaling for mates. So when one organism is advertising, another may not understand or even be able to see that advertisement, so they don't mate with one another, and that leads to them becoming different populations or different groups of individuals, and eventually different species once they become different enough, over time. So here we have a lot of selection going on for mates, and some are selected for, some are not, and that kind of leads to changes in the allele frequencies. Mechanical may be due to things like size. So some individuals might not just fit together in a way that they can successfully reproduce. Those mechanical differences in the overall size of one individual or one group of individuals versus another, or the reproductive parts matching properly for reproduction, would isolate them from one another, and they would then become isolated because of that, and they wouldn't be able to reproduce, and that would lead to them becoming different from one another. So we have different types of isolation, different ways that organisms can become isolated even when they overlap within the same habitat. Okay, so we have allopatric speciation, where they're just separated into two very distinct habitats. They cannot, no gene flow back and forth between the populations anymore, so that isolation is what keeps them apart and what then eventually leads to them becoming different species. If we have organisms that are in the same habitat, what sorts of things can then lead to them diverging from one another? Well, we have some behaviors, have physical differences that might occur between some individuals and others that allow reproduction or select for one group to reproduce with others like them and not others, and just when they're active or what seasons then they might be reproductive in. So these are all called pre-zygotic barriers. So that means before fertilization would occur. So obviously because they are active at different times of year or different times of day, they're not reproducing with one another. They are living in slightly different zones within the same overall habitat. They're not interacting with one another. Some don't like or even recognize the song or call of another, and behaviorally they don't interact or mate, or mechanically they just can't. They just don't fit together properly. But what if they do? So what if they do mate with one another? If they're the same species, then they'll have offspring, and then those offspring will be fertile, and they will have offspring, and so forth, and then they're the same species. They just might be different, and there's variation within them. But what if they try to reproduce with one another? They can overcome all these barriers, so they overlap with one another, they're reproductive at the same time, they can fit together, they can go through fertilization. But how do we know when they're different species? Well, we have then we call post-zygotic barriers. So if they're the same species, then they'll just reproduce and they'll have successful offspring. But if they're not the same species, or if they're on their way to becoming different species, then this is where some of these other things will come in. So when this is all after fertilization. So we're assuming a successful mating event has occurred, but now it's not going to proceed, or at least proceed properly. So one possibility is there's just inviability. So with inviability, the embryo just does not develop. So the individuals do mate with one another. There can even be fertilization. So in some cases there's no fertilization. In some cases there is fertilization, and the embryo may even start to develop, but it doesn't develop properly. And so it just stops development at some point, and this could happen over and over and over again. They're never ever going to develop into a viable individual, because there's just too many genetic differences between them for that development to occur properly. So it doesn't happen. Another barrier is infertility, but not infertility of those individuals, it's infertility of the offspring. So in this particular case, the embryo does develop. So development does occur, and we get an F1 generation. So two different parents come together, successful fertilization, successful development, individuals are born and they grow up to adulthood. And it seems like, oh, so these would be then hybrid, individuals. The thing is, these hybrids, because these original parents were actually different species, are infertile. So the hybrids cannot have offspring. So there will be no more in this line. So these parents can, or groups of those organisms, can keep mating and continue to produce these hybrid organisms. But the hybrid organisms can never produce others like them, because there are still too many differences from the parents to give them the ability to then pass on their own genes to their offspring. So they are infertile, and that's another barrier for identifying organisms as being two very different species, indicating that speciation has occurred between them. So even though they're very similar, they're so similar they can't even mate, and they can even have offspring. They're that similar to one another, yet at some point differences arose that were so great that makes it so their offspring cannot. And then the final seems like it would have been successful. So this is called hybrid breakdown. So in this particular case, it's really the F2 generation. So the F1s actually can. So it's like, oh wow, this really is then maybe the same species, because they can mate with one another, they can have offspring, the offspring can have offspring, but it's the F2s that are then either infertile or just don't develop. So more often that maybe fertilization does occur, so the hybrids actually can mate with one another, and they can fertilization can occur, but it just won't develop properly. So again, they don't have offspring at all, and so that's called breakdown. So these are sorts of barriers that tell us a couple different things. How do we determine that two organisms that are maybe similar to one another are the same species or different species? So with Darwin's finches, right, we had an original finch, the founder, and then that finch had diverse offspring. Those diverse offspring then took advantage of all the different types of food sources, seeds or insects or a variety of different types of things that they had, and those that had beaks that were better at cracking seeds fed more so on one type of food. Ones that had a different type of beak fed on a different type of seed, or on insects and so forth. As those birds then went to different islands, then they start to become distinctly different groups that stopped interacting with one another, and then they become different species overall. So from this genus Geospiza, you end up getting a variety of different species that all come from an original ancestral finch. And so that's kind of the idea, that they then became isolated. They then could not mate with one another. And but the point is here with this part of it down here is when. When do they become different species? It's when they become reproductively isolated, in the sense that post-zygotic barriers have occurred. All right. So the definition of a species, if we go back to species definition, is individuals that can mate with one another and have viable offspring. So offspring that both develop and that then are fertile and can pass on their genes to another generation. Then those individuals are considered the same species. But if that isn't the case, if these two individuals, they seem a lot alike, maybe they can even mate with one another, but if they cannot have offspring, and if they can't have viable offspring, then they're considered to be different species. And that's how we base our biological species definition. And so that's kind of all comes back to then how does speciation actually occur. So you kind of already have from the previous lectures more of the genetic aspect of it, how that occurs in terms of accumulating differences in genes and alleles and allele frequencies and so forth. And this is just giving you some of the terminology that's associated with describing the situations or conditions that arise that are part of that selection process or that isolation process that leads to finding groups that are uniquely different than others, or isolating groups, that might be different from others, and then leading to that process where they actually do become different over time.